While Cleveland's media ran with headlines mocking injury setbacks and pundits rushed to dismiss Shedeur Sanders as hype without substance, fans weren't buying it. On social media, in stadiums, and through merchandise sales, support for Sanders never wavered. Grassroots sentiment stayed steady even as professional voices turned hostile. And that disconnect didn't go unnoticed. Roger Goodell's intervention drew a clear line between elite narrative control and genuine fan perception.
If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
Recognizing that audiences are increasingly savvy about how race and reputation intersect in sports coverage. This moment isn't just about one quarterback, it's about trust. Goodell's decision to hold coaches and journalists accountable reflects a broader shift. The NFL must align with the values its fans demand or risk losing credibility. Shedeur's story shows how public support can spotlight injustice and force the league to respond with real structural change. This is one of the most consequential moments in the modern history of the NFL, and it didn't happen on a field, in a locker room, or at a press conference after a game. It happened because the league's most powerful figure stepped in and said flat out that what happened to Shedeur Sanders was not just mismanagement. It was targeted. It was systemic. And it was rooted in something far more insidious than poor football judgment. Commissioner Roger Goodell didn't mince words. He didn't hide behind platitudes or deflect blame onto vague organizational issues. He called it a coordinated campaign of hatred, a phrase that immediately elevated the stakes from a bad personnel decision to a crisis of integrity for the league itself. That kind of language isn't used lightly. It carries legal implications, cultural weight, and historical context. And in using it, Goodell put the NFL's values on trial. At the center of this is Shedeur Sanders, a rookie quarterback with elite college credentials, a football bloodline, and a name that comes with national recognition. He was supposed to be given the chance to grow into a franchise quarterback. Instead, he was shoved into the background. From the very start of his time with the Cleveland Browns, Sanders was denied basic developmental resources. No first-team reps, no huddle leadership, no time to build rapport with the starters. He was placed entirely on the scout team, the practice unit that exists to replicate other teams' offenses, not to develop your own. That move alone speaks volumes. You don't send your rookie investment to the scout team if you're actually trying to prepare him for the future. You don't freeze him out of live reps if you're invested in his growth. And you certainly don't allow him to be physically targeted in practice with no flags, no protections, and no consequences, unless you're signaling to everyone around him that this player isn't valued, isn't safe, and isn't part of your long-term plan. But it didn't stop there. As if being denied a fair shot on the field wasn't enough, Sanders became the subject of a deliberate and damaging media narrative, driven not by national outlets, but by prominent local Cleveland journalists. Tony Grossi, Mary Kay Kitt, and Jason Lloyd were all called out by name in Goodell's statement for their role in shaping a distorted public image of Sanders before he'd even played a single regular season snap. These journalists mocked his injuries, wrote headlines about trivial off-field incidents, and, most egregiously, advocated for his release. This was all done while Sanders was stuck behind closed doors, unable to speak for himself, unable to prove them wrong because he hadn't been allowed to compete. And this wasn't just lazy reporting. It was purposeful. It was coordinated. It was narrative engineering, and Goodell made that crystal clear by placing media behavior within the scope of the league's accountability structure. That alone shattered a long-standing wall in professional sports, the idea that media operates outside the consequences of league governance. The takeaway here is staggering. If your reporting plays a direct role in undermining a player's legitimacy, development, and public image, especially in racially coded ways, you're no longer untouchable. And while that has sparked backlash in some corners of the press, it also revealed just how long sports journalism has operated without checks. Because in the NFL, media framing doesn't just influence perception. It influences roster decisions. It influences locker room dynamics. It influences front office confidence. And when it's built on bias, subtle or not, it can destroy careers before they even start. That's what Shedeur Sanders was up against. And yet, even as the machine tried to spin the story, the fans weren't buying it. Fan support for Sanders remained steady and vocal. While the media mocked him and the team marginalized him, the public saw through the noise. Social media threads defending Sanders. Former players calling out the double standards. Fans dissecting practice footage and rep data. The people were paying attention. And what they saw was the truth. A talented young quarterback getting railroaded by a system that decided from day one that he didn't belong. That's why Goodell's decision hit differently. It wasn't performative. It wasn't empty rhetoric. It was reactive, responding to a real-time shift in public awareness. And it marked a fundamental change in how the NFL defines responsibility. Because for the first time, the league is asserting that player development isn't just an internal, team-level issue. It's a league-wide concern. The way a player is treated in practice, who gets the reps, who gets the protection, who gets the narrative support, that's now under the commissioner's purview. Which brings us to the most disruptive part of this entire saga, the potential removal of Browns head coach Kevin Stefanski. Not because of losses, not because of team morale, not because of off-field scandals, but because of developmental malpractice. Because the structure he oversaw, through action or inaction, was hostile to a young black quarterback in ways that can no longer be ignored or excused. If Stefanski is removed, it will be the first time in NFL history that a head coach is held accountable not for on-field results, but for the intent and pattern behind his personnel decisions. It would signal a seismic shift in league expectations for leadership, where fostering a culture of fairness, safety, and opportunity is no longer optional. It means coaches can't hide behind system fit when denying players opportunities. It means he's not ready is no longer a bulletproof excuse when rep logs and practice footage tell a different story. It means development is no longer private, it's policy. And what this moment makes undeniable is that race still plays a role in how quarterbacks are judged, developed, and discarded in this league. We've seen it with Lamar Jackson, with Justin Fields, with Jalen Hurts. It's always the same story: questioned leadership, supposed lack of readiness, outsized criticism of mistakes, endless conversations about can they run a pro-style offense. It's not always overt. In fact, it's usually not. But it's real. It shows up in the denial of reps, in the absence of protection, in the marginalization of injury concerns, in the way leadership is withheld until it's proven. A bar that, for some players, never seems to get met no matter how much they accomplish. This is what Shedeur Sanders was thrown into. And because of his visibility, his legacy, his name, his public support, the injustice became too obvious to brush aside. But what happens to all the others? The ones who didn't have the spotlight? The ones who were cut quietly after a year, called not a good fit, and quietly replaced without explanation? This is why Goodell's intervention has to be more than symbolic. It has to set a standard. Because if structural equity is only enforced when a player has public backing, then it's not equity, it's optics. The question now is whether this will be the moment when the NFL finally operationalizes the values it's been marketing for years. Will it follow through on what it just said, loudly and clearly, or let it fade when the news cycle turns? The league has a decision to make. And whatever comes next, it will echo. Because the next black quarterback who gets drafted into a questionable situation, the next player who gets sidelined with no explanation, who gets dogpiled by the local press, who gets labeled as not ready without a fair chance. Everyone will remember this moment. Everyone will be watching. If you've been tracking this story, hit that like button. Share it with someone who still thinks football is a pure meritocracy. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should developmental culture be subject to league oversight? Should coaches face real consequences for suppressing talent? Should media accountability be written into the future of this sport? And make sure you're subscribed, because if this is the beginning of structural change, you'll want to see how it unfolds. This is the test, not just for the Browns, not just for Goodell, but for the entire NFL. Let's see who steps up and who just hides behind the playbook. The stakes have never been higher. Not for a rookie quarterback, not for a coach, not for a commissioner, but for the very soul of the NFL. What happened to Shedeur Sanders didn't just expose one team's dysfunction. It tore back the curtain on a decades-old playbook, one built on plausible deniability, whispered gatekeeping, and institutional silence. And now, with the league's top executive publicly condemning what happened in Cleveland, every part of the machine is under the microscope. Because make no mistake, this isn't a story about a disappointing rookie year. This is about a system that chose not to develop a black quarterback, then turned around and blamed him for not developing. This is about the rep logs, the film, the practice reports, the silence from coaching staff while defenders repeatedly laid dangerous, unflagged hits on a young QB in drills. This is about the decision to deny him first-team exposure, to keep him from building chemistry with the offense, to lock him out of the huddle and the leadership moments that turn rookies into starters. This is about the unspoken message: you're here, but we don't want you to succeed. And then came the media. The moment the coaching staff froze him out, the narrative vultures swooped in. Local beat reporters who should have been asking, "Why isn't this kid getting real reps?" instead chose to dig up parking tickets, to mock injury setbacks, to question his character, to float the idea of cutting him before he even touched the regular season field. Tony Grossi, Mary Kay Kitt, Jason Lloyd, Roger Goodell named them. Let that sink in. The NFL commissioner, who typically walks on eggshells around media criticism, went on record and called out specific journalists for running what he framed as a racially coded, predatory media campaign. Not harsh takes. Not spirited analysis. A campaign. Coordinated, deliberate, damaging. He didn't accuse them of bias. He accused them of hatred. That is a legal, moral, and cultural escalation. A deliberate decision to frame this not as an unfortunate misunderstanding, but as a targeted effort with real consequences. Because media narratives don't live in a vacuum. They shape public opinion. They create pressure inside team facilities. And in a league where perception can dictate opportunity, those narratives can cost players their careers. Especially black quarterbacks. Let's not sugarcoat it. The position of quarterback has long been the NFL's final frontier for racial equity. For decades, the league kept black athletes out of the role under the guise of intangibles. Not smart enough. Not a leader. Not a field general. Not the face of the franchise. Eventually, the league started drafting black QBs. But even then, the leash was short. The room for error was microscopic. Every interception, every loss, every missed read wasn't a teachable moment, it was a referendum. And the path to redemption? Longer. Harder. Sometimes non-existent. Just ask Lamar Jackson, who had to win an MVP to be taken seriously. Ask Justin Fields, who was called a bust before his second season started. Ask Jalen Hurts, who led his team to a Super Bowl and still had to reprove his worth the following year. And now Shedeur Sanders. He didn't even get the opportunity to struggle. He didn't get the chance to grow. Because the system he entered, coached by Kevin Stefanski, covered by hostile local media, tolerated by team leadership, didn't treat him like a project. It treated him like a problem. And for the first time ever, the NFL didn't let that go unnoticed. Goodell's statement redefined the boundaries of league oversight. Until now, the league stayed out of developmental decisions. Who got reps, who didn't? Who led the huddle, who watched from the sideline? That was team business. Protected under the veil of football decisions. But that veil just got torn down. Goodell's intervention means the NFL is now willing to look at intent. At pattern. At culture. A player being denied reps isn't just a developmental issue, it's a red flag. A player being hit dangerously in practice without protection isn't just bad luck, it's negligence. And when a player is getting torn down by the press for minor, irrelevant issues, that's no longer just media freedom. It's now part of a larger conversation about fairness, access, and structural bias. And that is a game changer. If Kevin Stefanski is removed, it will set a precedent that echoes across every team facility in the league. Not because of a losing season. Not because of player revolt. But because of the environment he cultivated. A developmentally hostile, racially biased structure that stifled talent instead of building it. It would send a message to coaches everywhere. How you treat your players off camera now matters just as much as what you do on Sundays. That leadership isn't just about calling plays, it's about creating a space where players, especially those from historically marginalized backgrounds, can actually grow. And if the league really does start enforcing standards for developmental equity, not just competitive results, that will change how teams are built, how quarterbacks are groomed, how narratives are crafted, and how long it takes for a player to be labeled not ready. Because not ready has been the go-to excuse for years. It's vague, it's unprovable, and it sounds objective. But now when someone says it, there will be follow-up questions. What do the reps say? What does the practice film show? What was the injury protocol? What role did media pressure play in shaping that conclusion? Because if Shedeur Sanders had been white, would this have played out the same way? That's the uncomfortable question at the core of all of this. And no one wants to say it out loud, but the league just did, by acting, by naming names, by signaling consequences, by redefining what accountability in football looks like. And that's why this moment matters. Not because it will erase what happened to Sanders. The damage is done. His trajectory has already been altered. But because it may stop this from happening to the next player. The next quarterback who walks into a facility full of promise, only to find the door quietly closing behind them. Because of this moment, coaches might think twice before freezing out a prospect. Journalists might pause before floating character-damaging speculation. Front offices might demand more transparency around practice decisions. And fans will watch more closely because they've seen what happens when they don't. Shedeur Sanders may not have gotten his fair shot, but he sparked the beginning of something that might outlast his time with the Browns, or even his NFL career. A structural reckoning. A public declaration that development is not just a coaching detail. It's a matter of fairness, of ethics, of racial equity. And from now on it's league business. This story doesn't end with a statement. It doesn't end with a headline or even the potential firing of Kevin Stefanski. Because once the league crossed that threshold, once Roger Goodell called out systemic bias, named names and framed Shedeur Sanders' treatment as a coordinated campaign of hatred, the NFL opened the door to something it has tried to avoid for years: sustained accountability. Not the kind that comes with hashtags or press conferences during Super Bowl week. Not the kind that slaps slogans on the back of helmets. But real accountability. Measurable, operational, uncomfortable. And now that door is open, there's no shutting it quietly. Because you can't reframe an entire player's career as a cautionary tale and then go back to business as usual. The league drew a line. Not in theory. In practice. It decided that internal decisions, practice reps, player safety, media influence, matter. Not just in terms of performance but in terms of fairness. And more specifically, in terms of racial equity. That word, equity. For years the NFL has thrown it around like a buzzword. A PR-friendly way to acknowledge the league's painful history with race while avoiding any actual shift in power or process. Equity was something reserved for community initiatives, awareness campaigns, and diversity slogans during the draft. But Shedeur Sanders' case turned that word into a question. What does equity look like inside a quarterback room? What does it mean when a promising black quarterback is denied the very fundamentals of development, then blamed for not progressing? You can't have equity when reps are distributed unequally, when protections are given selectively, when injury narratives are weaponized, when journalists don't just critique, but actively undercut a player's legitimacy. That's what happened here. And the fact that it took this much visibility for it to be taken seriously is exactly the point. Shedeur had the name. He had the pedigree. He had the media attention that most rookies could only dream of. And still, the system nearly erased him before he ever played. So what happens to the players without the spotlight? The ones drafted in later rounds, or brought in as undrafted free agents. The ones who walk into a building and realize, sometimes on day one, that the opportunity they were promised isn't real? They don't get a commissioner's statement. They don't get journalists held to account. They just get replaced. That's the part of this no one likes to talk about. The players who aren't visible enough to spark outrage. The ones who get labeled raw or not ready, or not a good fit, and are gone before anyone asks why. That's why Shedeur's story matters even beyond what happens to him now. Because the harm is already done. The reps he didn't get? Can't be given back. The development curve he missed out on? You don't just make that up overnight. The hits he took in practice without consequence? That doesn't go away with an apology. But what can change is what happens to the next player. Because now the league has admitted, publicly, that there's a pattern. That coaching decisions, when made without checks, can reflect deeper racial biases. That media narratives, when left unchecked, can cause real, tangible damage. That accountability isn't just about results on the field, it's about the structures behind the scenes that dictate who even gets the chance to compete. That's why Kevin Stefanski being under serious consideration for removal isn't just unprecedented, it's symbolic. It tells every coach in the league that we didn't think he was ready, isn't going to cut it when the evidence shows the player never got a fair chance. It tells them that scout team assignments, rep counts, and internal culture are now part of their performance review. That it's not enough to win games, you have to build opportunity. And for the media? It sends a clear message. That the days of writing racially coded hit pieces and hiding behind, just doing my job, are over. If your reporting is used as ammunition in a system that erases players before they get a shot, it's not just unethical. It's now a league concern. That's what shook people. The fact that Roger Goodell, a man known for walking the tightrope between stakeholders, chose a side. Not the team. Not the coach. Not the media. He sided with the player. And not just any player, a rookie. A black quarterback. Someone who was given all the outward trappings of opportunity but none of the substance. Someone who was brought into the league, then buried before he could breathe. And maybe that's what this moment is really about. The difference between opportunity in theory and opportunity in action. Because if the NFL is going to preach values like inclusion and fairness, those values have to live somewhere other than a press release. They have to show up in team meetings, in rep charts, in how coaches are evaluated, in how beat writers are held responsible for what they publish. And the only way to get there is to expose what's been hiding in plain sight. That's what Shedeur's case has done. It didn't just shine a light on bad development practices. It exposed the mechanics of how a player can be erased before they fail. It showed us how race can still be the deciding factor in who gets protected, who gets elevated, and who gets quietly pushed out. And the most sobering part? If this happened to Shedeur, with the spotlight, then there are countless others who've already come and gone without a word. That's the legacy this league has to answer for. Not just what happened in this case, but what it reveals about years, decades, of unspoken decisions that shaped the quarterback room without anyone holding the pen accountable. So now the NFL has a choice. It can retreat, issue a statement, keep things quiet, hope the season distracts people, or it can make this moment matter. It can redefine oversight to include the development pipeline. It can put real standards in place that track how players are prepared, not just played. It can create systems where coaching decisions can be evaluated for fairness, not just outcome. It can establish boundaries for how media outlets cover unproven players, especially when the coverage veers into character destruction instead of legitimate critique. Because otherwise, this all gets repeated. A new quarterback comes in. The media starts chipping away at his credibility. The coaching staff withholds reps. Fans are told he's not ready. And another career ends before it starts. That's the cycle. That's the machine. And right now, it's up to the league to decide if it's ready to break it. If you've stayed with this story, drop a comment. Let's talk about what needs to happen next. Should coaching culture be a league matter? Should journalist conduct be subject to league ethics standards when their reporting clearly causes harm? And where does Shedeur go from here? Hit that like button if you're tired of football reasons being used to cover up everything else. Share this with someone who still thinks the NFL is immune to the biases the rest of society has to confront. And subscribe for more unfiltered breakdowns, because this isn't just a moment. It's a mirror. And now that we've seen what's in it, the league has to decide whether to look away, or finally start to change.